This is the Old West Element 3, Part 3, and we want to start this part of the conversation by taking a look at this map right here and reviewing a little bit. Now remember, this is where the tribes were located prior to Columbus arriving. They lived in these areas, they learned how to use the environment in these areas for food, shelter, clothing, customs, and developed their own languages and somewhat their own religions as well. Being in these areas and not moving is what taught them how to live for centuries. But even before the United States became a country in 1783, British colonization was already pushing Native Americans out. Take a look at the yellow areas here. These were lands lost by Native Americans before 1783, when the United States became a country. And between 1784 and 1850, the map would change to look like this, as white settlement pushed ever farther west, even going beyond the bounds of the Mississippi River, which you see right here. Now, the original plan was that Native Americans from the east would be just dumped into the west and told to coexist with other Native Americans that were out there. That, of course, led to a lot of tribal conflicts with each other, even before they started fighting settlers. Now you add white settlers to the mix, and you have an increasing problem. The Plains Indians called the whites the Wasichus, and Wasichu settlement intensified existing conflicts that were already in the West. Settlers brought cholera, typhoid, smallpox, and grazing livestock with them. But probably the biggest disaster was what white settlement did to the buffalo population, which dropped 85% between 1860 and 1890 during the settlement and Plains Wars period. This was an absolutely critical loss for Native Americans because they relied on the buffalo heavily and wasted nothing, whether it be the skulls, the bones, the hides, the meat, even the fat, which was boiled down to tan the hides. There was nothing on the buffalo that was wasted. But the popularity of hunting on horseback led to overhunting and added to competition for grazing lands. Everything on the buffalo was wasted by guys like Buffalo Bill and other buffalo hunters. All they wanted were the hides for coats and hats and things like that. They made no use of the meat or anything else. And sometimes, when trains were going west, novice hunters would go to the back of the train and just shoot buffalo for sport. Now, eventually, this is going to become what historians call the Plains Wars that took place between roughly 1860 and 1890. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 and the Fort Atkinson Treaty of 1853 are really what start the ball rolling on what would become the Plains Wars, as they created the reservation system in the West. Native Americans were told to stay on their reservations, which they referred to as islands made by the Wasichus, and not interfere with white settlement in the West. Now, the natives agreed to these treaties if they could get supplies from the U.S. government to help them survive. But the problem was that government agents from the Bureau of Indian Affairs were often corrupt. Now, this whole thing was a foreign concept to Native American tribes to be put on these islands in the West, so they had absolutely no trust in the U.S. Army. Matter of fact, the only ones they trusted were who they called the Buffalo Soldiers, former slaves who were now in the Army. So tensions were evident between the two sides, but they were still coexisting until the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864 in Colorado, where a number of Native Americans were slaughtered and mutilated. They in turn responded with a massacre of their own in 1866, known as the Fetterman Massacre on the Bozeman Trail. In this case, white soldiers were the ones that were being slaughtered. Native Americans started leaving reservations to seek out white settlers and scare the settlers off, and often send messages that no other settlers should come back out there. One of the ways to send those messages was by scalping. When a Native American would grab you by the hair, run a knife across your forehead, and just peel your scalp right back until it came off. And no, this is not a mock-up. You are looking at this guy's skull. Now, even surviving one of these was pretty rare in and of itself, because often you die from the trauma or from the infection that was left after the scalping had happened. Now, for a young man, getting a reputation for bravery might be as simple as doing something called counting coup, which was running up to your enemy in the middle of battle and tapping him on the shoulder, just proving you were brave enough to get that close. But for a warrior, the scalp was the trophy and the true sign of bravery. Now, scalpings were pretty effective warnings, but there were other methods as well, particularly in the American Southwest. In places like Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas, Native Americans might come across your homestead and lock your wife and kids inside of it while they were still alive and then set it on fire so that they could burn to death. But you wouldn't be put in there as the father. No, you'd be taken out front. You'd be stripped of your clothing in the desert sun, laid on your back, and then you'd have a wrist tied to a post in the ground with another wrist tied to another post, an ankle tied to a third post, and another ankle tied to a fourth post with wet leather straps. They'd also put a wet leather strap around your throat as well. So the desert sun, which is now sunburning and just destroying your unclothed body, is also drying these wet leather straps so that you are agonizingly being pulled in 4 different directions very slowly as the straps start to shrink by drying and slowly constrict around your throat, slowly choking you while you listen to your wife and children burn to death in the house that you had built. Wow. So the U.S. Army set out to protect the settlers, putting forts all over in the West. They would use these as their headquarters, but they were also places where settlers could go if Native American raids were happening in the area. Settlers could be protected, and the soldiers would go out and fight the Native Americans to try to drive them off and make the area safe for white settlement. That doesn't mean it was easy, though. Native American tribes were very good at using their local environment, remember, so they were very good at coming up with poisons to put on the tips of arrows and use those in battle. Now, you didn't need to be hit flush with an arrow. All it had to do was nick your neck or nick a part of your skin or something, and the poisons would take effect. One young man wrote in his diary as he watched a soldier die that the soldier was describing the way ants were eating him from the inside out as the poisons were taking effect. Ouch. Okay, so once again, these conflicts between the Native Americans who had left the reservations to get rid of the settlers and the soldiers who were out there living in forts trying to protect the settlers and provide them protection within the fort anytime Native Americans would show up to their homesteads. Once again, these are called the Plains Wars. And some of the more famous wars take place in places you might know. For example, right here near the panhandle of Texas was the Comanche War, which was especially difficult because the Comanches were excellent horsemen. You can see right here, it was well known that Comanches could actually slide down to the side of the horse and shoot arrows over the top of the back of the neck, or sometimes shoot shotguns under the neck at an opponent. That was pretty difficult to deal with. There were also the Navajo and Apache Wars in modern-day Arizona. One of the most famous figures of those wars being the Apache chief Geronimo. In the modern Dakotas were the Sioux Wars, modern-day South Dakota, that is. Famous figures from this war include Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, who actually has a monument being built to him out in modern-day South Dakota, not far from Mount Rushmore, actually. And the Sioux Wars were also famous for this entanglement right here at a place called Little Bighorn in Montana. You more likely know it as Custer's Last Stand in 1876. George Armstrong Custer had been a corporal in the Civil War, and when the Plains War started, he was promoted to general. Custer had gone out there with a lot of optimism, intending to clear the way for gold prospecting. It didn't go well. His entire regiment died. Another famous conflict in the Plains Wars was a year after Custer's Last Stand. It was called the Nez Perce War that took place in the Northwest, starting in modern-day Idaho and modern-day Oregon. In this war, Chief Joseph eventually led his tribe along this route right here, 1,700 miles toward Canada. He was attempting an alliance with Sitting Bull, who was fleeing Montana after Custer's Last Stand. As you can see here, Chief Joseph would surrender here before reaching Canada at Bear Paw Mountain. And it was there that Chief Joseph uttered some of the most famous words in Native American history: "I will fight no more forever." Things started changing dramatically for Native Americans by 1880. In the 1880s, Sitting Bull eventually joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The Wild West show traveled all over the United States and even performed for kings in Europe. It was meant to show everyone what life in the West was really like if they hadn't been there, but it was not a very accurate representation. All the major stereotypes that you would think of were there, everything from the whites always winning and being the heroes to Native Americans saying few things other than "how, white man," as Sitting Bull was supposed to do. Eventually, the Plains Wars would, in effect, come to a close after almost 30 years of fighting, right here in South Dakota on the Sioux Reservation at the Massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. Once again, this effectively ends the Plains Wars. The reason that the conflict started in the first place was because 200 Native Americans started performing what was called the ghost dance. It was meant to call on their ancestors and drive the whites out and make things as they were before. The whites, of course, saw this as a threat and figured they'd better do something about it because Native Americans were getting fairly riled up. The result was that 200 Native Americans were murdered for doing the ghost dance, including Sitting Bull, who actually had not participated in the dance but was just a part of the crossfire as soldiers started breaking into tents and small buildings looking for people. Mass graves were soon dug at the end of the massacre, and Native Americans were buried in those mass graves. It kind of symbolized the final battle of the Plains Wars. So, in review, by the time it was all said and done, Native Americans had shrunk from this to this by 1850, shortly before the Civil War, to this by 1890 and the end of the Plains Wars. The green areas are the lands reserved for Native Americans. It's a vastly different picture than what was there before. But the question became what to do with Native Americans now that the Plains Wars were over. The debate began with Helen Hunt Jackson, who wrote A Century of Dishonor about the government's poor record in dealing with Native Americans. That inspired sympathy, and people wanted to hear their story. Humanitarians wanted to treat them kindly, but hardliners wanted to continue the existing policy. The problem was neither respected their culture. Both sides asked them to give their culture up, even withholding food to make sure that happened. One of the most prominent places of assimilation, as it was called, assimilating to white society, was the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, which was founded in 1879. The motto of the school was "Kill the Indian and save the man." As you can see here, Native American, I believe Navajo, named Tom Torlino, entered the Carlisle Indian School in 1882, and you can see on the right what he looked like after 3 years of assimilation. The idea behind assimilation schools was to separate Native Americans from their tribes to civilize them. The idea was to learn English, become Christian, change your name, and change your appearance. And if you decided not to, there were whippings for that, as well as whippings for any connections to your formal tribal culture. If they found anything connecting you to your old tribe in your drawers or in your room or whatever the case may be, then the whippings would continue on. And as you can see here, the Carlisle School had a fairly large population. But the Plains Wars and assimilation were also happening politically. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 ended tribal ownership of land, gave each individual Native American 160 acres of free land on a probationary basis, provided they could act like quote-unquote good white settlers, and if they could, they would get full title to the land and full U.S. citizenship, completing the assimilation process as a whole. The remaining former reservation land was then sold off to railroads and settlers, with the profits used to establish more assimilation schools. An attempt at reversing this policy would happen 47 years later with the Indian New Deal of 1934, which encouraged tribes to establish local self-government and to preserve their traditions. But many tribes refused to follow it. To them, it was too late, and it was like the government was just trying to turn them into museum pieces, as one tribe said.